The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes. I think he's the last one that's asked to speak.
I'm sure people are excited about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go over a couple of points that just for me, I think provide clarity as to some of the challenges with this version of the bill. First, Mr. Bishop mentioned that sometimes we want to seem to actually be doing something as opposed to actually doing something, but in the last Congress, the version that Mr. Thompson will offer as an amendment in the nature of a substitute worked for both parties. So last Congress, it worked as something that was actually doing something, and I think it is the better of the two versions for a couple of reasons. One, we've talked a lot about the definitions. They're mostly the same between the two pieces of legislation, but in this instance, without the waiver, there's a number of potential issues, mainly in foot faults, right? Inadvertent violations, not by the Stanfords, not by the Texas A&Ms, not by the University of Maryland, but in my district, New Jersey City University, a small college that is primarily for first-time college graduates, had a relationship with Confucius Institute, which they terminated. Now, under the definitions, a relationship is any agreement, not like significant funding, not being in your research facilities. It's any agreement, which to me can not even be a monetary arrangement. It could be an exchange of students. We've talked about what happens if there is a relationship. Well, one is people say that they can terminate. Mr. Bishop and many others are attorneys, so not knowing what those agreements are and what the ability to terminate those agreements immediately might mean that they lack the ability to do so and therefore would not be able to receive any funds from the Department of Homeland Security. Even if they are able to terminate the agreement, it says shall be eligible. So that doesn't mean any funding that they get from DHS is automatically reinstated. So it could be a particular grant that they lose funding for. They'd have to reapply. That could take several years. That could have an impact on a lot of different universities, not the Stanfords of the world, but the community colleges, the smaller universities in all of our states and districts. And to me, that's why the issue of a waiver is so important, because we can send a signal to China. We can be strong on this issue, but I don't think we should inadvertently potentially penalize the smaller colleges and universities, which were covered in the prior legislation. That, to me, are the critical differences. Send a strong message, but let's not inadvertently penalize some smaller universities that may not have the resources to monitor this legislation, especially, as Mr. Pfluger has said, this is difficult to figure out which entities we're talking about if it's not the Confucius Institute, because as you said, as LLCs, can change form rather quickly. So can some of these, what are we calling them? Chinese entity of concern. And I think for those reasons, my preference, which was a bipartisan proposal in the last Congress, is the better approach here. We can do both things. It actually is doing something as opposed to just seeming to do something, as I believe you all felt in the last Congress. With that...
will the gentleman yield?
Sure thing.
30 seconds.
Yeah.
The gentleman yields.
It's not any relationship. It's any relationship with an entity of concern as defined through the definitions that go through a military application. So it's not any agreement. And in the case of New Jersey City University, if they had a relationship that then applied to those definitions of a civil military fusion or military strategy or as defined here, then it would be limiting, because the entity of concern was used by DOD as a morphing mechanism to identify that Confucius Institutes were named that, and then they morphed. And these names, these players might have changed, but the strategy and the desire to undermine national security did not. So it is not any relationship. It's a relationship with an entity of concern as named by DHS for good reason. I'll yield back.
I appreciate that, and I'll reclaim. And I understand your point in terms of, because there's two parts, right? The entities, that identifying which entities we're talking about with entities of concern, right? And then also the type of relationship, right? And the type of relationship can be any type of relationship with the set university or set list of institutions. And to me, that's where you potentially get into some issues.
If the gentleman will yield.
Sure.
The type of relationship is very important. You've rightly pointed that out. It's a monetary relationship. It's a relationship.
I reclaim on that, because as I'm reading in Section 4, relationship, the term relationship means with respect to an institution of higher education, any contract awarded or agreement entered into, as well as any in-kind donation or gift received from a Confucius Institute or Chinese entity of concern. I see potential donation as a monetary component. I don't see with respect to agreement entered that it has to be a monetary funding agreement. And I would yield back if you would like to correct me.
I think the intent of this is monetary. I think that fairly clearly says that any contract awarded or agreement entered into as well as an in-kind gift or donation.